a railroad town, like hundreds of other towns along the tracks west in the 1880s. A town left behind when the first transcontinental railroads rushed their rails across the frontier landscape. Along the muddy streets, more and more storefronts are popping up. Businesses, hardware, outfitter, grocer, blacksmith, barber, saloons. Many saloons. Something's missing. There's no church. Lodge halls, but no church. More and more families are coming to town to join husbands and fathers, men who came west to find their fortunes, farming, mining, working on the railroad. A lot working on the railroad. Life's pretty wild in town, no doubt about it.
We need a church. Kids need Sunday school like back home east. This town ain't no place to raise a family without a church.
It's not that some haven't tried to get a church going. A preacher came into town with his horse and wagon several months ago from Philadelphia. Got a nice group together. They met outside in nice weather, but when the cold winds began to blow, they had to disband. Several other padres and preachers tried. Some lasted a while. Others were discouraged by the saloon element and left town. You know, religion ain't good for the saloon business.
A Baptist missionary, Boston Smith, came to a Minnesota rail town like this, along the Northern Pacific Railroad. Everyone called him Uncle Boston. He had a Sunday school meeting outside and was determined that it was not going to fail when winter came. Why not ask for permission from the Northern Pacific Railroad to use one of their cars during the winter months for a church? He asked the town agent, and he received permission. The group met in that railroad car all winter, and as the band of faithful grew, so did support for a building. The Baptist Home Mission Society gave them a low-interest loan. Now, the town will have a church. Boston Smith got an even better idea. Why not build a church in a railroad car that could travel to all the little towns along the rails and stay long enough to organize and build a church? Uncle Boston discussed his plan with his good friend, Reverend Wayland Hoyt, pastor of the First Baptist Church of Minneapolis. The Reverend's brother, Colgate Hoyt, was vice president of several railroads, including the Northern Pacific. Reverend Hoyt had seen the same sights Boston Smith had seen along the routes of the Northern Pacific and other railroads, towns without churches. He asked his brother to do something about it. So Colgate Hoyt organized some rich Baptist laymen, including John D. Rockefeller, James Colby, and William Colgate, to donate money to build a church car. They called it a chapel car. Before that Baptist chapel car could be built and put into service, the Episcopal Bishop of North Dakota, Bishop William David Walker, beat them to the draw. Bishop Walker had traveled to Russia. There, he saw the beautiful chapel cars of the Russian Orthodox Church, built to be used on the Trans-Caspian and Trans-Siberian railroads. With these 5 cars, priests were able to offer the sacraments to the people who lived and worked along the construction route of the Trans-Siberian Railroad, then and now the longest railroad in the world. Like Boston Smith and the Hoyts, Bishop Walker was concerned about the people who lived in his vast North Dakota frontier, people who seldom, if ever, had the opportunity to receive the sacraments or the ministry of a priest. Though the census of 1890 officially recorded the passing of the frontier, much of the West still remained a frontier for the church. If Walker could build a chapel car, like the Russian cars, he could reach some of those people. He could take the church to them. In 1890, Bishop Walker, with the help of Cornelius Vanderbilt and other donors, had the Pullman Palace Car Company build the Church of the Advent, the cathedral car of North Dakota. In that 60-foot-long car, the first American chapel car, the bishop was able to travel to numerous hamlets dotting the countryside. Bishop Walker brought those North Dakotans the beauty of the worship experience. The organ, played by the bishop himself, the oak altar, the lectern, the font, the stained glass rose window, the rows of chairs, the beautiful ceiling stencil designs, and at the rear of the chapel area was a vestry and bedroom where the bishop could change his clothes and sleep.
I do not believe it to be a Western exaggeration to say that a larger torrent of able-bodied people has swept into this section than ever entered any section of land since time began. Everywhere I go, the car is filled or crowded. The only exception was a little place last night. The hamlet, however, consisted of only 4 dwelling houses, 2 wheat elevators, and a railroad station. Yet there were from 30 to 40 persons present at our worship. The same service in a cheerless schoolhouse, if there had been one, would probably not have called out 1/4 the number of people. This is the story everywhere. The compactness, the dignity, the simple beauty of the car wins the people. Its hearty service, too, reaches their hearts.
The Church of the Advent, the Cathedral Car of North Dakota, was in service until about 1899. When it was taken out of service, hundreds had experienced the beauty and peace of the rites of the church in the first rail chapel car in America. Between 1890 and 1900, the Episcopal Church would see 2 more rail chapel cars in service, not in North Dakota, but in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. In 1891, Episcopal priest Gershom Mott Williams was named Archdeacon and Rector of St. Paul's in Marquette, Michigan. He would be elected Bishop of the Diocese of Marquette, later renamed the Diocese of Northern Michigan in 1896.
In the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, Bishop Williams' Episcopal Diocese included a large number of small, isolated logging and mining settlements. With a very few good roads, especially in the winter, the railroads were really the only way of reaching these communities. Many would not see a pastor for months at a time. In order to minister in these locations, Bishop Williams used an old railroad car, possibly a Northwestern caboose, that had been outfitted as a chapel. In 1894, he obtained a better car, which may have been a 50-foot railroad business car, very similar to this one here in the museum in the background. You can see by the model I have made of what the second Michigan car might have looked like, how it would have been arranged. In one end was a kitchen and living area, probably left over from the business car use. The rest of the car would have been cleared for a chapel with an altar rail, lectern and organ at one end, and the rest equipped with pews or seats. This was pretty typical arrangement for both Episcopal and Catholic cars of that period. With the chapel car, Bishop Williams and other clergy could visit towns up and down the railroad lines, bringing ministry to areas where there were no organized churches or clergy. Diocesan records in those days weren't very detailed, but 2 different years' reports list the various towns that the chapel car visited during that year. Most of these stops were along the east-west railroad line of the Duluth, South Shore, and Atlantic, many of these being little sawmill town locations. Other trips were made into the Michigan copper country, where there were a lot of little mining towns, and a few other visits were made toward the south in the area along the northwestern. The last mention of the Episcopal car was in a 1901 diocesan report that said it had been used in Chippewa County in the eastern end of the Upper Michigan Peninsula. We now know that the chapel car was sold in 1905 to the Munising Railroad, where it was put in maintenance away service. Now, in 1995, during the diocesan centennial year, we were doing a history, and it was discovered that the chapel car was still in existence. It had become part of a store building in Negaunee, Michigan. Unfortunately, we tried to purchase the car and raise the money to save it, but it failed, and the car was sold to a buyer in the Chicago area.
Bishop Williams thought that one way the chapel car could be used was as a temporary church when, as frequently happened in the Upper Peninsula, a town would burn as a result of a forest fire. He was right. The town of Ontonagon was completely wiped out by fire on August 25, 1896. According to fire department reports, the alarm was sounded at 1:10 p.m. and the entire town was gone by 5 p.m. A wind had sprung up from the southwest, driving the smoldering swamp into a blaze. Everyone broke for the noon hour at the Diamond Match Company mills, but upon returning to work at 1, the men at the West Side Mill were alarmed to see that the swamp fires had advanced on the mill buildings. Evacuation of the dozen or so houses on the west side of the river was begun minutes later. One of the mill buildings took fire. From this point on, there was little hope. Along with the town went the Episcopal Church, built in 1854 of materials transported from Detroit on a chartered schooner. That church, the oldest continuously still active in the diocese, played an important role in the Michigan Chapel Car history. For it was at Ontonagon that a third Episcopal Chapel Car, the second chapel car of the Diocese of Northern Michigan, came to serve as the religious center for that community, while the people set about rebuilding their town and their lives. While the Episcopal Chapel Cars were prowling for souls in the corners of North Dakota and the wild Upper Peninsula of Michigan, Baptist missionary Uncle Boston Smith finally realized his dream. The American Baptist Publication Society was ready to put the first of 7 chapel cars in service. Chapel Car Evangel was built by the Barney and Smith Car Company of Dayton, Ohio, a company known for their fine wood craftsmanship. To the last detail, Evangel was a church on wheels as well as a compact, well-equipped parsonage. Boston Smith met William Mellon, the general manager of the Northern Pacific Railroad, and was provided with a letter to superintendents and conductors, which issued free movement of the chapel car along railroad lines. Without this offer of free transportation, the chapel cars could have never been able to operate. Boston Smith was proud of that letter.
You will pass Mr. Boston W. Smith and one attendant with Chapel Car Evangel over our lines. You will arrange to take the car on any train he desires. You will sidetrack it wherever he wishes. Make it as pleasant for Mr. Smith as you can.
Word quickly spread about this Baptist church on rails. Evangel had an effective publicity campaign. Publicity was patterned after that of traveling circuses and theater cars that visited many of the same rail towns. Flyers were posted on every store and saloon in town, as well as around the railroad depot. Along the route, chapel car workers threw Sunday school papers to excited little boys and girls who came to watch the train go by. In this way, the gospel was carried into thousands of homes along 1,000 miles of Northern Pacific track through Minnesota, North Dakota, and Montana. On Evangel's maiden trip across Minnesota in 1891, Brainerd was the first stop. At all the services, the car was crowded to overflowing. Most who attended had not been inside a church for many years. At Fargo, the great wheat buying center of the Dakota Territory, Evangel stopped for 3 successful meetings. Many of the settlers in this area worked on bonanza farms built by the Northern Pacific Railroad. These farms were as large as 100,000 acres in the valleys of the James and Red Rivers. At Billings, Montana, there was no lack of excitement. Boston Smith reported on the activities of the town.
We conducted several meetings in the car, to which came a number of Montana cowboys. A murder, a lynching, and the killing of 2 Indians were among the happenings of the town about the time of our arrival, a place where the gospel is surely needed.
In the spring of 1892, Evangel, with Reverend and Mrs. Wheeler on board, came into the infant town site of Everett, Washington, and started the first church on the Bayside, even before the saloons wwere running. On Easter Sunday, April 17, 1892, Wheeler conducted the first baptism in the Bay. It was quite an event. Folks thought the Baptist car was here because the men who owned most of Everett, Colgate Hoyt, James Colby, and John D. Rockefeller, were supporters of the Baptist car. The town of Everett didn't fare well because of the business dealings of those men. Everett almost collapsed during the hard times of 1893. But that church congregation, started by the chapel car, still worships not far from the bay. The Wheelers headed southwest in 1894 on a trip which would take them across Arizona, Texas, and New Mexico. This time they were traveling in chapel car Emmanuel, newly built in 1893 with donations from Baptists all over America. This second 80-foot-long Baptist car was reported to be the longest railroad car in service at the time. At El Paso, the Daily Herald reported on the chapel car.
Mr. Wheeler is a forcible and interesting speaker, and his wife is a lovely and entertaining woman. The public is taking very kindly to them both, and the car may be expected to be crowded at all of the services.
At Roswell, in the New Mexico Territory, a small band of Baptists had started a two-room church in February 1895 under the leadership of missionary O.P. Miles. Looking for ways to encourage the fledgling fellowship, Miles heard that the chapel car was in El Paso. On April Fool's Day, Emmanuel rolled into the Roswell Depot on the brand new Pecos Valley Railroad in the midst of a terrible sandstorm. The Roswell Register was reporting about a Methodist sandstorm in town stirred up by evangelist Abe Mulkey.
Abe Mulkey is turning Roswell upside down, as it were, and giving it a cleaning out with strong men with tears streaming down their faces.
Wheeler was no slouch himself in stirring up souls. 23 came forward after the first meeting in Emmanuel. The next day, he baptized them in a river that flowed from Artesian Springs. After a stop at Carlsbad, New Mexico, the Wheelers worked their way west to Arizona's southern frontier. Mining towns like Nogales, Naco, Douglas, and Bisbee were a new challenge for the Wheelers. Phelps Dodge Mining acquired the Atlanta claim at Bisbee in 1881 and combined it with the rich Copper Queen in 1895. Emmanuel came into Bisbee in the spring of 1895 on the Arizona and Southeastern Railroad, just completed in 1889. At the time of Emmanuel's visit, Bisbee had 50 saloons. 15 of these were located in Brewery Gulch, just across the sewer-filled road from the depot where the car was sighted. The area was overrun with tramp miners, gamblers, con artists, and prostitutes who congregated in its saloons. At Holbrook, near the petrified forest, there were no churches. Holbrook boasted, well into the 20th century, that it was the only county seat in the United States that did not have a church of any kind. Some faithful met in homes and others in the schoolhouse. According to local legend, the Bucket of Blood Saloon controlled the town and opposed the building of churches. If a church wasn't welcome, a fancy eating place with pretty girls was. Fred Harvey established a temporary restaurant here in 1884. As elegant inside as Harvey's other establishments, the restaurant was located in 5 old boxcars parked near the Holbrook Depot. With Emmanuel parked nearby, the Wheelers were close enough to smell Fred Harvey's food, if not to enjoy it. Although civilized enough for Fred Harvey, there would be no church in Holbrook until 1913. The Bucket of Blood had good reason to fear For just after the Methodists built the first church in town, the old saloon closed its doors. At Flagstaff, the Wheelers thrilled to views of the majestic, snow-laden San Francisco peaks. Other sights in town were not so inspiring. Incorporated a year earlier, the Atlantic and Pacific Railroad had set up Flagstaff as a base in 1880. Delay in the construction of the Canyon Diablo Bridge kept the railroad crews at Flagstaff, where they spent their money on diversions such as gambling, drinking, and prostitution. Wheeler reported on the morals of Flagstaff.
Gambling was wide open, and not all the games were honest. Prostitution flourished in the saloons that were located just across the street from the depot where Emmanuel held services. The soiled doves were a constant affront to the decent women of the town. And in addition to such vice, the saloons were the site of frequent fights, often punctuated with gunfire.
Williams was a division point on the Atlantic and Pacific Railroad, a line eventually to become part of the Santa Fe. Not long after Emmanuel's visit, rails would be extended from here to the rim of the Grand Canyon itself. As frequently occurred, the chapel car was sighted just a few yards from Saloon Row and was packed. As Emmanuel filled with worshipers, the pool halls of Williams emptied of sinners. At Hackberry, west of Williams, there was no church or Sunday school. The missionaries were surprised to find that the Indian children who filled the pews spoke good English. After the southwestern visits, the Wheelers shopped the car in Sacramento. As they headed for a Minnesota vacation, Reverend Wheeler was thrown from his seat and killed when a washout wrecked their Atlantic and Pacific train. His wife, seated beside him, was unharmed. A stained glass panel in Chapel Car Emmanuel honors his memory. Wherever the chapel cars traveled, they would minister to rail workers. At Muskogee, Oklahoma, railroad employees attended services in Evangel, morning, noon, and night. Those same meetings were held in Sacramento, Livingston, Portland, Los Angeles, Fort Worth, Denver, Kansas City, anywhere there were rail shops. At Sacramento, Reverend and Mrs. Hermiston of Chapel Car Emmanuel held services for over 1,000 men in the railroad shops. The men loved to hear Mrs. Hermiston and their daughter sing the old gospel hymns. Perhaps it reminded them of their mothers and their childhoods back east. Maybe of better times, at least gentler times. Reverend Charles Rust of Chapel Car Glad Tidings often spoke of his work with the railroad men in the shops along the lines in Minnesota, the Dakotas, Wisconsin, Nebraska, and Iowa.
I think I can safely say that there's never a meeting without some railroad men in it. I could give you letters from section men and brakemen, conductors, dispatchers, and wire agents, and many others who've been blessed because of the meetings in Glad Tidings. I remember writing to an agent in a town where we'd once been sidetracked, asking him if he could give me the same trackage again, and I received a message in a day or two, which read like this.
Dear Mr. Rust, your letter at hand. You may have any track you want, but the main line. If that will not do, I will make one that will.
During the 1880s, the railroad network of the United States grew to over 93,000 miles, equal to 70% of the mileage built in the preceding half-century. Along with the growth of the railroads came an increase of workers. In 1895, almost 900,000 were employed by railroads in the United States. The chapel car workers held services for these men in yards and shops midday and midnight. Charles Rust handed out cards saying, "Come just as you are." Bare-armed, dirty, work-clothed, they came. by the thousands. Rust related that he stood at the door of the chapel car and grasped the hand of each man.
Look at this man, who is reaching up now in some haste. He is the engineer of a stationary engine in the shop. He's been in the car each noon, but cannot stay for the entire service, as he is obliged to run to his engine to blow the whistle at 12:45. He hardly can part with the missionary, and says,
God alone knows what the chapel car has meant to me. I have not been in church for years, but you have brought the church to me.
Just before the turn of the century, the missionaries on chapel car Goodwill made their way into West Texas. The work in Texas, as elsewhere, was among railroad men and their families, at division points and in large shops. To struggling Texas churches, often pastorless for a year, the visit of the chapel car was the event of a lifetime. Such a place was Tenaha, 16 miles from the eastern border of Texas, in the heart of the piney wood. Reverend and Mrs. Townsend were now on Goodwill.
We stopped for only a day or so, waiting for mail, before going west to a cooler clime. We began to preach 4 times a day. The people began to come from miles and miles around. They came to see that church on wheels. Twice we were forced to move, seeking a larger building. On the 3rd Saturday, I say, there were 1,000 people present.
I wish you could look in sometimes on the car filled with a squirming mass of young humanity. Their heroic attempts to sing the new songs, their blank dismay when called upon for scripture verses, and their pathetic apology. See their delight when we give them the story papers and scripture cards, the eagerness with which they listen to the scripture lesson and the bright, amusing stories.
A little over a year after marriage and coming to chapel car Goodwill, Holly Townsend died, giving birth to a baby boy, one of only 3 babies born in chapel car service. With a heavy heart, Townsend visited Del Rio in December and then went west, establishing a new congregation at Comstock, Texas. The Galveston, Harrisburg, and San Antonio Railroad Company built westward through Valverde County in the late 1880s. Along this railroad, town sites were laid out at 30-mile intervals, including the town of Comstock, where Judge Roy Bean was the law of the Pecos.
We are now on the southwestern border, not only of Texas, but also of the United States. Across the Rio Grande River in Mexico, the Santa Rosa Mountains lift their heads far above the clouds. This is the frontier of 2 republics. We found a resting place at a little station, Comstock. There are not a dozen houses in sight. Yet from the ranches for 12 and 20 miles, the people came and filled the car.
On September 8th and 9th, 1900, Galveston, Texas was struck with what was to be known as the Great Storm of Galveston. Chapel car Goodwill was in the shops at Galveston at the time of the storm. 2 years earlier, missionary Townsend and his wife had worked with the Third Baptist Church in Galveston and had gotten to know Pastor Lane and his family well. Pastor Lane, with his entire family, was swept away in the devastating flood. At the time of the storm, Brother Valley Hart was assisting on the chapel car.
I have visited the car sheds of the Santa Fe shops where the car is, and the management has placed the car in the best possible position. The fearful storm demonstrated this. To the east of the chapel car on the track is placed a great engine, which protected the car from the drift in that direction, and the drift from the bay side was caught and held by large posts supporting the shed. And while the debris is piled up all around and inside the shed, not one plank was hurled against the car. While one portion of the shed was torn away and wrecked, that portion over the chapel car Goodwill was not harmed.
Celebrating the centennial of the Louisiana Purchase, the World's Fair was held in St. Louis in 1904. Messenger of Peace was displayed by the American Baptist Publication Society in the Transportation Building from opening day until its close. Bishop David Walker, creator of the first American chapel car, the Episcopal Cathedral Car of North Dakota, visited missionary Joe Jacobs at the fair, as did Father Francis Kelly of the Catholic Church Extension Society. From the visit of Father Kelly and his enthusiastic impression of Messenger of Peace, the Catholic Church Extension Society would build 3 chapel cars in the coming years. For a number of years, the American Baptist Publication Society had wanted to have one of the chapel cars work with the Railroad YMCA, and in 1910, Messenger of Peace was the car chosen for that opportunity. In the 1800s, particularly before rail unions, life on the rails was cheap. Crews suffered impossibly long hours, unfit food, and infested beds. Many of the frequent train wrecks could be laid directly to long hours and the undesirable pastimes of the workers. As a result, thousands of railroaders and passengers were killed or maimed. The Railroad Ys, organized April 14, 1872, provided a safe, wholesome home for thousands of railroad men across America, a place where they could find clean beds, good food, reading material, healthy physical activity, and spiritual guidance. As Messenger of Peace worked with the International YMCA along the lines of the Chesapeake and Ohio, it stopped at Thurman Station, a wild mining town in the dangerous but beautiful New River Gorge of West Virginia. The only way into this area was by the railroad that pulled the chapel car along the cliffs of the gorge. Thurman was at its prime in October of 1911 when Messenger of Peace was sighted near the busy station, which saw more than 200 people a day disembark. Due to the strict moral code of the town's founder, Captain William Dabney Thurmond, there were no saloons in the town limits. But Thurmond was an island of sanity in a sea of surrounding immorality. Amidst hostility from saloon owners, a little church was built in the mountain hamlet of Red Star in cooperation with the Railroad Y at Thurmond. After Father Francis Clement Kelly saw the Baptist chapel car Messenger of Peace at the St. Louis World's Fair in 1904, he too got an idea. Like Boston Smith and Wayland Hoyt before him, Father Kelly was heartsick to see rail town after rail town without churches. The Pullman Company was disposing of older Wagner cars, so Father Kelly approached Pullman Vice President Richmond Dean, a member of the Catholic Church Extension Society Board, about buying one of the old Wagner sleepers. Ambrose Petrie, a prominent Catholic businessman, offered to contribute $2,000 to the project. Pullman records show that on July 7, 1907, Petrie bought Wagner Palace car Mentone, which had been built in September of 1886. Richmond Dean had the interior of the car reconstructed for chapel car use.
After its dedication, St. Anthony left Chicago's LaSalle Street Station on the evening of June 16, 1907, for Wichita, Kansas, where it would be at the service of Bishop John J. Hennessy of the Wichita Diocese. The bishop and other missionary priests would tour the branch lines of the railroads running through Kansas, stopping at towns where there were no Catholic churches to bring Catholicism to isolated members of the faith. For more than 40 years, 3 Catholic Church Extension Society chapel cars traveled across the South, Midwest, and Northwest. The car's visit was a major event in small rural towns. You had people who felt isolated, forgotten, hopeless. And here came a chapel car on wheels that, even by today's standards, was a work of art. It had all the look and feel of a cathedral right in the middle of a prairie or cotton or wheat field. It was a sign to people, Catholics as well as non-Catholics, that the church cared about them. If they couldn't come to church, the church would come to them. And people responded. If you look on a map today, you'll find dozens of churches along the railways from Oregon to Florida because the chapel cars stopped there. That's been Catholic Extension's mission, to bring the church to the remote corners of our country where people have no access to the church.
On board St. Anthony was layman George Hennessy, a jovial, red-headed Canadian Irishman who was the cousin of Father Kelly. According to Kelly, George was gifted for chapel car work. He had been an altar boy, knew the ceremonies, had a beautiful Irish tenor voice, and could play the organ. Along the Kansas route, the cooler weather of harvest time brought relief to Chaplain McKernan and Hennessy. Life became more bearable than it was during the warmer season, when the temperature in the chapel remained about 100 degrees, sometimes soaring to 106. The question of provisions was very satisfactorily solved by the contributions made to the larder whenever they had occasion to stop. The car was iced and watered while in transit with the same care and attention as were the cars in commission on the regular trains. Much of Chapel Car St. Anthony's work was in Oregon. Hennessy was constantly amazed at the still vast frontier of Oregon.
From the main line of the Harriman system, the branch goes out from Deschutes Junction, and from 1:30 p.m. until 5:45 that evening, you do not strike a town. All this time it is one continuous climb of 3,400 feet above sea level. It is 118 miles from the main line to Madras, the first town of any size. And until reaching this town, you're surrounded at all times with mountains and pass through not a few tunnels. Previous to the railroad coming to this part of Oregon, these missions were attended by driving, by stage, and on horseback, from 60 to 100 miles at one time.
The chapel cars would often be on the first train into town. The Santa Fe Railroad came to Rolla, Kansas on March 15, 1913. When the first train came through town, quite a crowd gathered at the station, and the town history records that people used a passenger car for a chapel and gave thanks for the coming of the railroad. That passenger car was Chapel Car Evangel, with Reverend and Mrs. John Killian aboard. On April 29, 1913, the first lots of Elkhart, Kansas were sold, tents put up, and the town was established. 10 days later, 100 business lots were sold, plus several residential lots. Cash Wilson's Pool Hall was one of the first buildings in town, along with Robert's Grocery, Carey's Livery Business, Mrs. Farmer's Hotel, and the Star Lumber Company. About 6 weeks later, a train whistled into town. On the rear end was Chapel Car Evangel, with Reverend and Mrs. Killian on the observation deck, waving to the children along the tracks. Chapel Car Evangel would not be the last chapel car seen in Elkhart. For just a few months later, a beautiful steel chapel car would pull into the same station, Catholic Chapel Car, St. Peter. This first steel chapel car was the result of a visit of Peter Kuntz to the old St. Anthony Chapel Car. Peter Kuntz, a Dayton, Ohio businessman known for his charitable giving and deep religious convictions, toured St. Anthony. After examining the renovated old Wagner car, Kuntz, never a man to mince words, asked the chaplain on board why his society didn't build a good chapel car instead of this old thing. It was very likely that Kuntz had noticed the brand new Baptist cars coming out of the nearby Barney and Smith shops and had made some comparisons. So, in 1912, the Catholic Church Extension Society turned to the Barney and Smith Car Company to build their second car, a steel St. Peter, with a $25,000 donation from Peter Kuntz. St. Peter took its mission to the Mexicans of Kansas. The first Mexican mission was at Hutchinson, where daily attendance averaged 75. When Father Serrano arrived at Hutchinson with St. Peter, the very sound of his velvety Castilian tongue caused a train of memories in the souls of the Mexicans of the town. From Mass, with instruction in the morning, to catechism for the children after dinner, to meetings with the rail workers in the evening, the chapel car was full. There was a score or more of daily communions. All approached the sacraments at least once. 18 children made their first Holy Communion on the last day, the children from the Catholic school singing during the Mass. There were marriage kinks untwisted.
When we moved away, it was very gently. The engine seemed to understand the sorrow of these poor neglected Catholics. Everyone had to kiss the missionary's hand and say goodbye. There were many tears on the sturdy faces of those sun-bronzed trackmen. Here and there, a woman sobbed. Children kissed their fingertips to say adios. And as the engine slipped around a bend, we realized the sorrow that had come into the lives of that little group of exiles from war-scarred Mexico, for their beloved padre had gone.
The Baker heaters were a problem shared by all the chapel cars. In March 1914, George Hennessy was fed up with the antics of St. Peter's Baker heater, which was supposed to have been repaired at the Parson shops of the Missouri, Kansas, and Texas line, known to all as the Katy. A frustrated, angry, and cold Hennessy wrote to the Katy shops.
The pipes leaked in the very spot that was supposed to have been fixed in your shops. The water ran all over the floor in the chapel, and I was obliged to drain the water entirely from the pipes, and it has not been used since. Today we are suffering with the cold on this account, for it is blowing a fierce Kansas gale here at this moment, using 4 oil stoves to keep this little room warm. Now, that's the way the repairing was done. Do you think a job like that is worth the bill?
The response from the Katy office was that they were not responsible for the problems, as all tested well when the car left the shops, and their best man did the work. Hennessy, with the Irish wit that was his trademark, replied,
I suppose the poor Katy will go out of business if this bill is not paid. I am enclosing a check for $33.40. $33 as a donation, and 40 cents for the work done during the 4 days the car was in the shops at Parsons.
Chapel car St. Peter had been the first steel chapel car constructed by the Barney and Smith Car Company. Barney and Smith management had delayed conversion to steel construction of passenger cars, insisting the public would never favor all steel cars over the woodworker's art. By the time the company finally produced its first steel passenger car, it had suffered through its 3rd straight year of losses. In 1912, the company showed a modest profit, and 1913 began as an even more promising year, until March 25th and the Great Flood of Dayton.
Bells rang and whistles blew, utterly failing to rouse people to a sense of their danger. A brown wave of water 6 feet high rolled its foaming crest westward on the streets, and meeting at each corner a similar wave from the north, piled the water into a raging torrent, which filled the streets with foam and wreckage and bodies. The surging waters of the Mad River obliterated restraining levees and poured into the Barney and Smith car works, inundating the plant under 14 feet of water.
Precious hoards of rare wood for car interiors were swept away. Pieces of teak and mahogany were fished out of the water as far downstream as New Orleans. The flood caused more than $1 million worth of damage to the car works, dealing the company a blow from which it would never recover. The company would build 2 more chapel cars, great arks, not with the gopher wood of Noah's specifications, but with steel and great interior panels of polished mahogany and oak. These cars would be Catholic Church Extension Society's St. Paul and the American Baptist Publication Society's Grace. Sometime around the summer of 1914, Peter Kuntz dropped into the Chicago office of the Catholic Church Extension Society. He asked how St. Peter was doing. When told by Father Kelly that it was doing splendidly, he offered to build another car. After its dedication at New Orleans in the spring of 1915, the first stop for the new St. Paul would be Bunkie, a growing town on the Texas and Pacific Railroad in central Louisiana, populated mainly with descendants of the Acadian exiles. Father Alva Duran was the chaplain. At Cheneyville, the chapel car congregation was made up of Italians, Mexicans, French, Irish, Creole, and blacks. But Duran reported that most were Italian.
The Italians preponderate, and it is only fair to say that along this line of railroad, they are the finest of their race the chapel cars have found. Zealous, affectionate, industrious, and practical. They pushed forward the building of the church, have fenced it in and laid out a garden with their own hands. They claim the missionary as their own because he spoke a little of their mother tongue. They are mostly from Palermo.
Due to war restrictions and the refusal of Louisiana railroads to permit free transportation for the chapel car, St. Paul was stored away in a railroad yard at New Orleans. St. Paul would have continued to sleep on a siding in New Orleans if it weren't for the young Father Vincent Pratz. In 1920, the huge Milam Morgan Mill stood in the new parish of St. Leo the Great, assigned to Father Pratz. No church existed. Father Pratz suddenly remembered chapel car St. Paul. He rushed to the streetcar line that would take him to Archbishop John Shaw's residence, from whom he obtained permission to use the chapel car. After anxious moments getting permission to use a siding at the mill, Father Pratz offered the holy sacrifice of Mass in the new parish of St. Leo the Great for the first time on Sunday, February 13, 1920. The car was jammed to capacity, and many more people stood outside. Father Pratz occupied the living quarters of the car. Like the other missionaries who would serve on St. Paul, he discovered that in summer, the car was an oven from the metal construction being exposed to the sun. In winter, it was an icebox from lack of adequate heating facilities. Devoted Father Pratz stayed with his chapel car for 9 months while funds were raised and a frame church built. When St. Paul was starting out in service, Baptist chapel car Herald of Hope began its ministry to miners and their families in West Virginia, especially down the valley of Kanawha. The car could not have come at a more crucial time, with strikes and floods occurring up and down the creeks and hollows. During a period of service in the Nitro Dunbar area, Reverend Newton and the Herald of Hope ventured down Cabin Creek. Here, they ran into angry miners. Someone at Eskdale along Cabin Creek tried to dynamite the chapel car. This was not surprising, since this was a time of unrest in the mines when all outsiders were suspect. Newton went from house to house inviting people to church. He wrote, "I made over 20 calls, got my organ and singing books, and we had the chapel car filled. Chapel Car Grace was the last of the American fleet of chapel cars, completed in the spring of 1915. To the delight of Reverend and Mrs. Hermiston, and to the envy of all the other chapel car missionaries, the length of the chapel had been reduced to include a separate bedroom with a full-size brass bed. The other Baptist missionaries had to sleep in berths, as did the priests and assistants on the 3 Catholic cars, although several of the Baptist missionaries had modified their sleeping arrangements with couches and fold-up tight beds to fit into the compact living quarters. At 134,000 pounds, 85.5 feet long, 13 feet tall, and 10 feet 8 inches wide, Grace was certainly not dainty, but Grace was churchier than the other Baptist chapel cars. It was the desire of Publication Society officials that this car look more like a church, and the panels, pews, and golden oak interior were executed in Gothic lines, but honoring and preserving the less embellished traditions of the Baptist concept of worship. No doubt, some of the Gothic touches were the same as those installed in Catholic Church Extension Society Chapel Car St. Paul, which was in the finishing stages, while Grace was being started in the shops. Cathedral touches were added by the diamond motif stained glass door panel leading into the living quarters, the green-leaded arch art glass window trim in the upper sashes and clerestory windows, and the gold-lettered God is Love window over the pulpit platform. One of Grace's first stops after the Los Angeles dedication was at the 1915 Panama Pacific International Exposition in San Francisco. By Sunday, September 19th, St. Peter arrived for exhibition at the Southern Pacific Depot with new carpet in the sanctuary and replated cross, candelabra, and chimes. Hennessy and Father Walter O'Brien had been instructed to take special note of all the points on the new Baptist chapel car. This wasn't difficult for George to do, as St. Peter was coupled to Grace. They couldn't have been any closer.
I'm Ken Giacoletto, president of the Green Lake Conference Center, and I'd like to welcome you to Green Lake, Wisconsin, home of Chapel Car Grace, the finest restored chapel car in existence in the United States today. By 1943, the world was very different than the 1890s world of the first Baptist chapel cars. Towns were less isolated, churches were more common, and the railroads were no longer in their heyday. They had long ago stopped providing free passage for the chapel cars. Before being retired here at Green Lake in 1946, Chapel Car Grace served all over California, started the First Baptist Church of Las Vegas, Nevada, and encouraged congregations throughout Wyoming's Wind River Valley. In the town of Orem, Utah, among a mixture of war plant employees, ranchers, and Mexican farm workers, Grace came to its last place of active service.
The site of the huge Geneva Steel plant at Orem presented unique problems for missionaries Howard and Mary Perry. Indifference, long working hours, and the inconveniences of trailer life made the mission especially difficult. But Howard Perry, like the chapel car missionaries before him, loved his chapel car and loved the people he served. On Tuesday, June 6, 1943, Perry printed in his diary in big letters,
Invasion. Landed 3:32 a.m. U.S. time, Normandy coast. Cherbourg, 80 miles from English coast. Air arms struck shortly before midnight.
When the Second World War ended, so did the era of the railroads and the era of the chapel cars. For most of the cars, the end of the line had already been reached. Some of the chapel cars were scrapped. Portions of other chapel cars were sometimes incorporated into church buildings. Others exist today only as rotting shells with no hope of restoration. The second Episcopal Chapel Car of northern Michigan is being redesigned in a private museum in Illinois after serving as a craft shop in Naugany for many years. Chapel Car Emmanuel is on the National Register and is being beautifully restored at Prairie Village, a turn-of-the-century town in Madison, South Dakota. Chapel Car St. Paul hosted a Mass in 1985, celebrating the 80th anniversary of the founding of the Catholic Church Extension Society. After a long residency at a museum in Nevada City, Montana, St. Paul was recently moved, and its eventual disposition is unknown at this time. And Chapel Car Grace rests in a place of honor at the American Baptist Assembly at Green Lake, Wisconsin, still used as a house of worship, faithfully preserved and visited by hundreds of men and women, boys and girls each year.
In the night shadows of 100 valleys, hamlets, hills and hollows, farm communities and prairie towns, all along America's railroad tracks west, if you wait quietly, oh so quietly, if you shut out all the sounds and sights of contemporary life, you just might hear a mournful call of an old steam whistle and smell coal oil lamps burning and see silhouetted against the glow on the art glass windows the bowed heads of men and women and little children. And if you listen carefully, very carefully, you can hear on the soft evening breeze the sound of a hymn, vigorously, lovingly, pumped out